There are moments in history when the world holds its breath. Moments when the choices of two men carve the fate of millions. This was such a moment. Once they stood side by side, brothers in triumph, champions of Rome. But power is a fire that does not warm, it burns. And what began as loyalty soon turned to jealousy, fear, and betrayal. On one side, Gaius Julius Caesar, a man of the people forged in the harsh dust of battlefields. On the other, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, hero of old victories, the Senate's final hope. Two giants, two visions for the world, one destiny, and when they finally met on the fields of Pharsalus, history itself changed course. They were not born as enemies. Long before the dust of war rose between them, there was a time when Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great walked the same road, shoulder to shoulder, bound not by hatred, but by trust. They shared victories, feasts, and visions for the future of Rome. There was a moment when their hands clasped as allies, as brothers in ambition. One young and rising, blazing with potential. The other seasoned and proud, already crowned with glory the world respected. Rome watched them shape destiny. Pompey had earned his name through triumph. The conqueror of pirates, the commander who stretched Rome's reach across seas and continents. He stood adorned with the old Roman virtue of honor, admired in senate halls and whispered about with reverence in the markets. He was the man Rome believed could do no wrong. Then came Caesar, a man forged not in marble halls, but in mud, hardship, and the grit of marching legions. He ate beside his soldiers, slept beneath the same cold stars, bled where they bled. He won not from the voices of senators, but from the hearts of the men who followed him, and Rome began to look upon him with wonder and fear. But at first, they did not clash. At first, their strengths completed one another. Pompey offered legitimacy. Caesar offered momentum. Together, they formed a power so immense, Rome bowed without being commanded. Yet power changes men. The greater Rome grew under their influence. The smaller the world became for two lions forced to share the same ground. Pride, that ancient serpent that coils itself around the hearts of great men, began to whisper. Whose glory was greater? Whose vision would shape Rome's next dawn? Who would be remembered as the true savior of the Republic? The bond between them began to thin. The Senate, that old nest of ambition and fear, saw the crack form and drove a wedge deeper. Whispers in corridors, promises over goblets of wine, subtle nods of threat and persuasion. They reminded Pompey that he was Rome's chosen hero, the defender of tradition. They warned him of Caesar's rising star, too bright, too fast, too beloved. And as envy found its home, loyalty began to decay. The death of Julia, Caesar's daughter, and Pompey's wife sealed the divide. She had been the bridge between them, softening anger, mending pride, reminding them that even the mighty deserve peace. But when she passed, the last thread of warmth snapped. What remained were two men staring at one another across an invisible battlefield. Caesar continued to win victories, conquests in Gaul that made him the most celebrated commander in Rome. His triumphs fed his legend, and his legend fed the fear that Pompey and the Senate could no longer ignore. What had once been brotherhood became threat. What had once been alliance became destiny at odds. And so the sands of trust slipped away, grain by grain. In Rome, people spoke not of if they would clash, but when. Two eagles cannot fly forever under the same sky. The world felt it. The soldiers knew it. The gods themselves must have watched in silence. For here stood two of the greatest men Rome had ever known, each believing he was the one chosen to guide her future, each convinced that the other's victory would plunge the world into ruin. And thus, history did not shape them. They shaped history. Not with friendship, but with a fracture that would ignite a war. A war not just for power, but for Rome's very soul. Rome was a world built on law, tradition, and pride. But by the time Caesar and Pompey began to turn against one another, those foundations trembled like old stone ready to crack. The Senate, once the mighty heart of the Republic, was no longer a council of wisdom, but a battlefield of ambitions wrapped in togas and cloaked in polished words. They feared Caesar, not because he threatened Rome, but because he no longer needed them. His legions loved him. His victories glorified him. The people, those who crowded the markets, who drank from the fountains, who prayed at the temples, spoke his name with admiration that bordered on devotion. And devotion is dangerous. Power that comes from the people is not easily controlled. The Senate saw it spreading like fire across the countryside. a fire they could not extinguish with decrees or speeches. So they looked to the one man who could stand against him, Pompey, the hero of Rome, the favored son of the Republic, the man whose statue stood in the Forum, whose victories were remembered in every classroom where young boys learned of Rome's glories. They told him the Republic needed protecting. They told him Caesar sought a crown. They told him that only he could restore balance. But the truth was quieter, colder, and far more human. They feared being forgotten. The Senate believed that if Caesar returned to Rome triumphant, the old world, their world, would be swept away. Their power was not built of courage. It was built of influence, inheritance, and the ability to decide who mattered in Rome. And Caesar threatened to make them irrelevant. So they declared him a traitor, a tyrant in waiting, an enemy of the Republic. But the Senate did not speak for Rome. It spoke for itself. Pompey, however, he believed them, or perhaps he wanted to believe them. For in Caesar's rising star, he saw his own beginning to dim. The people watched all of this unfold. Not through speeches, but through whispers carried in the wind, through glances exchanged in taverns, through the uneasy silence of soldiers polishing their armor. They knew Rome was changing. It was no longer a question of right or wrong. It was a question of which Rome would survive. The Rome of the Senate, rigid, old, tradition-bound, or the Rome that Caesar promised new, ambitious, and unafraid to reshape the world. The atmosphere grew heavy, like the air before a storm that is not yet broken. Friends avoided political conversation. Families whispered behind closed doors. Legionaries sharpened their blades with thoughts they dared not speak aloud, for everyone understood. If Caesar returned with his army, there would be war. The Senate demanded he lay down his command, to return to Rome not as a hero, but as a prisoner of their judgment. They asked him to surrender his power, to surrender his honor, to surrender his destiny. But Caesar was not a man who surrendered. Not to foreign kings, not to armies, and especially not to men who feared him. The stage was set not by swords, but by pride, by fear, by the quiet, inevitable unraveling of trust. Rome stood on the edge of a precipice, staring into the deep unknown, and the world watched, waiting for the first step that would determine its future. The river was small, shallow, quiet, a narrow ribbon of water flowing through the countryside of northern Italy, nothing more. To the common traveler, it was just another crossing. But on that winter night, beneath a sky heavy with clouds and fate, the Rubicon was not merely a river. It was a boundary, a law, a warning. A line that no general was ever meant to cross with his army, for to cross it meant treason. To cross it meant war. Caesar stood at its edge, the cold wind biting his cloak, the distant murmurs of his soldiers fading into stillness. He knew the weight of this moment. Behind him lay the honor and loyalty of thousands who believed in him. Ahead lay Rome, suspicious, fractured, waiting. He could still turn back. There was still time to yield, to obey the Senate's command, to lay down his power and trust that his enemies would show mercy. But Caesar knew better than to trust men who feared him. He looked toward the horizon, toward the city he had served, bled for, conquered in the name of. Rome had been the dream, but now Rome was the battlefield. He drew in a breath heavy with memory. He remembered the battles in Gaul, the frozen rivers, the cries of war that echoed through forests and fields. He remembered the men who followed him through storms, disease, and hunger, not because they were ordered to, but because they believed in him, believed in his vision, believed in his destiny. What kind of leader would he be if he abandoned that? Yet even the strongest hearts tremble before the leap that will change everything. The soldiers watched him. They said nothing, but their silence spoke enough. Their armor glinted faintly in the night, wet with mist. Their hands rested on shields worn from years of marching at his side. These were not just soldiers. They were his brothers, his family formed not of blood, but of shared triumph and suffering. And they waited for his decision. Caesar's eyes lowered to the water, a small stream. But in that moment, it appeared deeper than ocean. He whispered, not to his men, not to the night, but to history itself. The die is cast. With those words, he moved forward, one step into the river, then another. The water broke gently around his boots, as if nature itself bowed to destiny. His horse followed, then his officers, then the legions, silent, steady, unstoppable. Shields, banners, footsteps in perfect harmony. The sound was not loud, not thunderous, but it echoed across centuries. For once Caesar crossed the Rubicon, the world could never return to what it once was. This was not a march. It was a promise that he would not surrender to fear, a promise that he would not kneel to men who sought to chain greatness, a promise that Rome would be reborn through war if that is what fate demanded. As dawn crept into the sky, the land awoke to news that traveled faster than any messenger. Caesar is coming, and Rome trembled. For one river had been crossed, one choice had been made, and the course of history had been set into motion. The sun rose slowly on the plain, as if reluctant to witness what was about to unfold. The air was thick with dust, the kind of dust that clings to the throat and weighs upon the soul. Across the field, two armies stood facing one another like two storms frozen in a breath before the lightning strikes. On one side stood Pompey, the Senate's champion, the relic of Rome's ancient pride. He commanded an army vast in number, legions fresh, shining, orderly, adorned in the confidence of a world convinced of its righteousness. Senators rode beside him, noblemen and old generals who believed they were defending the Republic itself. Their banners fluttered like proclamations of destiny. On the other side stood Caesar, not with shining recruits but with veterans, men who had survived the frozen rivers of Gaul, who had crossed mountains and seas at his command. Their armor was dented, their shields worn, their swords marked by years of war. But their eyes burned with loyalty deeper than law, deeper than fear. They had not come to fight for Rome's Senate, they had come to fight for Caesar. The two men who had once stood as brothers now faced one another across the battlefield. No words left to speak, only the final judgment of steel and blood. Pompey believed victory was certain. He believed in numbers, he believed in tradition. He believed in the weight of Rome's old order standing at his back. But Caesar believed in his men, in their discipline, their memory of hardship, their unity, their unshakable trust in him. And sometimes belief is the stronger weapon. The horn sounded. A low, deep howl cut through the still air, followed by the thunder of marching feet. The ground trembled as thousands surged forward, shields locking, spears braced, voices rising into a roar that swallowed the sky. The clash was not graceful. It was raw. It was raw. The kind of battle where every breath might be your last, where every heartbeat was a prayer no God answered. Pompey's cavalry thundered forward. A brilliant maneuver, one that should have shattered Caesar's lines, but Caesar had anticipated it. In silence, he had hidden a reserve, his best veterans, men who needed no command to understand the moment. When Pompey's cavalry struck, Caesar's hidden line moved, not with panic, not with hesitation, but with precision honed by years of war. They drove forward, not to kill, but to bring certainty. And certainty broke. Pompey watched from his command post. For the first time in years, doubt crawled into his heart. He had believed numbers were enough, but he had forgotten that wars are not won by counting. Won by counting, wars are won by men. As Caesar's veterans pushed forward, the Senate's proud legions began to falter. Their shields shook, their formations wavered. And once the line cracks just once, the whole army feels it. Panic is faster than courage. Pompey's grand army began to break. One cohort fled, then another. Then the field turned from battle to collapse. Caesar did not cheer. He did not exult. He watched in silence, his face carved in stone. For he knew what had been lost here was not just an army, it was the Republic. The dream Rome had once believed in fell that day. Not because of ambition, but because of the weakness of those who claimed to protect it. And as the dust began to settle, Pompey, once the greatest man Rome had ever known, turned his horse and rode away from the field. Defeat had found him, and destiny had chosen another. The battle was over. The dust settled like a veil over the broken field, covering the fallen, covering the blood, covering what once had been pride and certainty. Caesar stood not as a conqueror returning from triumph, but as a man who understood that victory often carries a weight heavier than defeat. Pompey fled, not to regroup, not to reclaim his honor, but to escape the shadow that now followed him. He sailed across the sea to the shores of Egypt, seeking refuge from those who once called him the greatest of Romans. But fate is patient and history is cruel. He arrived not to welcome, but to betrayal. A blade in the sand, a quiet killing. No grand speeches, no final command. Pompey, the great hero of Rome, conqueror of nations, died on a lonely shore, not in glory, but in silence. When the news reached Caesar, he did not rejoice. He turned away. For even in war, there are wounds the sword cannot give, only sorrow. Pompey had been his friend, his ally, his rival. the mirror to his own ambition. To see him fall was to see the price of the path Caesar had chosen. Yet the world does not pause for grief. Rome awaited him. When Caesar returned, the crowds roared not with fear, but with admiration. They filled the streets, chanting his name not as a general, not as a citizen, but as a savior. Laurel wreaths showered the air. Temple bells rang. Rome embraced him not as a man, but as something greater. The Senate bowed. The laws bent. The traditions of the Republic began to crumble, not with a blow of a hammer, but with a quiet acceptance of the inevitable. For they knew what had happened to the Republic. Once the pride of Rome, once the beating heart of freedom had died in the field of Pharsalus. And in its place, something new began to rise, an empire. Not yet in name, but in reality, Caesar became the center of power. His will became Rome's law. His vision became Rome's destiny. But destiny is rarely kind. Behind every triumph, shadows grew, whispers of conspiracy, fear hidden in smiles. Daggers wrapped in the folds of Senate robes. The world had been changed, the course of history forever altered. What began as a rivalry between two men had reshaped the future of nations, of empires, of civilizations yet unborn. And though Caesar stood at the height of glory, one truth remained: greatness does not come without cost. For in winning Rome, he had lost something far deeper: a brotherhood, a friendship, a piece of his own soul. The battle had ended. The world had changed. And history, ever watchful, carved their names into eternity. Caesar, Pompey, two men whose choices forged the empire that would rule for centuries. But the empire was born from ashes, from rivalry, from ambition, from the tragedy of two giants who could not share the same sky.